And the only interesting question is whether Trump is going to put those three people to the side and he's going to negotiate a deal with the Russians. Trump wants peace, unlike Kellogg, unlike Lindsey Graham. There's no question about that.
So recently, John Mearsheimer was on Andrew Napolitano's podcast talking about the recent Istanbul conference between members of the U.S. presidential administration, Ukraine, and Russia for what may well be Ukraine's last chance at peace in resolving their conflict with Russia. Now, Mearsheimer here seems to articulate what it might take to secure peace and why he's a little bit skeptical that that will happen anytime soon, at least. I can't wait to hear what he has to say, so let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
As we speak, Professor Mearsheimer, Secretary of State Rubio, Foreign Minister Lavrov, and Ukraine President Zelensky are all in Istanbul, theoretically talking about ending the Russian-Ukrainian special military operation. Is it realistic to think that a settlement of any significant magnitude will come out of this?
No, I don't think it's possible, because I think the two sides here, and we're talking not just about the Americans and the Russians, but we're talking about the United States, Europe, and Ukraine on one side, and Russia on the other side, have fundamentally different goals. I mean, the Ukrainians do not accept any of Russia's major demands, and Russia is insistent that all of its major demands be met. And how you reconcile those stark differences is not clear to me. Furthermore, if you take this a step further, this whole negotiation process is completely Looney Tunes. It's not clear who's in charge, when they're meeting, who's meeting. I've never seen anything like this. And when you have tough substantive differences between the two sides, to maximize your chances of getting some sort of agreement, the diplomatic process has to be handled in a smart way. And this is anything but a smart way. So,
yeah, I have to generally agree with Mearsheimer here. Unless Ukraine agrees to abide by some of Russia's base asks, including the the Russian possession and gains of Luhansk and Donetsk and the People's Republics there, and unless the U.S. prohibits NATO from allowing Ukraine to join as a new member state, and NATO withdraws some of its forces from Eastern Europe, I don't think this is going to go anywhere, especially as the U.S. continues to funnel money there, even under Donald Trump, who campaigned on ending the war there. So Zelensky is hell-bent on trying to get more than he turned down at Istanbul the last time, which didn't even include any Donbass gains that Russia now clearly has. So until the U.S. recognizes this and Ukraine is willing to play ball with this, I don't think this is going anywhere. And I think the ultimate answer for Trump is just bypass Ukraine. This can be your negotiation. To hell with Ukraine. You told Zelensky the right thing in the White House. He doesn't have the cards to play here, and he's gambling with millions of lives by holding out. He can't get a settlement better than what he turned down in Istanbul, and trust me, the U.S. was complicit in that, Boris Johnson was complicit in that, and NATO was complicit in that. But now there has to be recognition of Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, and a prohibition on Ukraine ever being part of NATO, as we know from cables that were released by the great Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. NATO membership of Ukraine represents the reddest of red lines for NATO. That has never changed. They've never wavered on that.
Nowhere.
Yeah, President Erdogan of Turkey presided over, or facilitated, I should say, negotiations back in 2022, before the first shot was fired, when the Russians and the Ukrainians agreed on a 26-page agreement, every page of which was initialed. That's when Joe Biden and dispatched Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, to talk President Zelensky out of it. Are they naive enough to think that hundreds of billions of dollars and a million lives, and 3 years later will produce a similar outcome?
It's hard to believe that they think that. But I believe they think if they prolong this war, they can wear the Russians down and the Russians will ultimately give up and we will win. I think this is foolish in the extreme. I think the Ukrainian military is in deep, deep trouble. I think the Russians are going to just conquer more territory if the war goes on and more Ukrainians are going to die. But the Europeans themselves and the Ukrainians don't accept that logic, and they want to continue the fight. And what they want to do is keep the Americans in the fight with them. And
Yeah, I generally agree with Mearsheimer here, but I would even go a step farther, where he says that maybe some people that want this war to keep going is intended to wear Russia down. But I actually don't think that in some ways. The great Julian Assange, who I mentioned earlier, his best maybe sentiment to humanity was when he said the modern military-industrial complex and war machine don't want successful wars. They want endless wars. And why would they want an endless war over a successful war, or a war that wears Russia down? It's to wash taxpayer money from the base and send it to the military-industrial complex, which thrive over these long, decade-spanning conflicts, like Afghanistan was for 20 years. That was the cash cow for Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. Ukraine has served for that in the United States for the last few years, as well as Europe's military-industrial complex. So there are more incentives than trying to wear Russia down to keep this war going if you're a warmonger that wants it to continue.
go ahead.
Here's the nominal spokesperson for the Europeans, Prime Minister Starmer, just a few hours ago. Chris, cut number one.
What's happened today is further evidence that it's Putin who is dragging his feet. It is Putin who is causing the delay in a ceasefire. Ukraine has long been clear, several months ago now, that they would have a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, and we have long said that it's Putin who is standing in the way of that peace. He was the aggressor in the first place. There was only one country that started this conflict. That was Russia. That was Putin.
Only if history began the day before the invasion on 2022 in February 2022 is that true. We all know, people that watch this channel know, that this conflict goes way farther back than that, including the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Ukraine under Yanukovych in 2014, and the several ways of NATO expansion up to that point, to the war that took place after the overthrow in 2014 in the Donbass and the Minsk Accords that attempted to settle this. Keir Starmer is telling a fairy tale here, and actually, Russia hasn't budged from its ask continuously for decades. They want to prohibit Ukraine from joining NATO. They want the dual-purpose missiles, including the Aegis systems that can fire a Tomahawk with offensive weaponry into Russia off of the border.
There's only one country now standing in the way of peace, and that is Russia, that is Putin. That is why we need all nations to line up together as allies to ensure we get the ceasefire that is so desperately needed, but also to ensure that we have sanctions in place should Putin continue down this path of dragging his heels and not coming to the table for the ceasefire.
Takes this seriously. This is like a mouse going after an elephant. But does the Kremlin take this kind of a threat, a warning, seriously?
Well, what the Kremlin, I am sure, understands from listening to Starmer and others like Keith Kellogg and Macron and so forth and so on, is that there's no way you're going to get a peace agreement anytime soon. And this one is going to be settled on the battlefield. And therefore, what Russia wants to do is Russia wants to show that diplomatically it is a reasonable country. I mean, you're not going to get an agreement, but if you're the Russians, you want to show that you're reasonable. And you also understand that the longer the war goes on, the better it is for you, because you will end up conquering more territory and you'll end up doing more damage to Ukraine. And this is in Russia's interest, given the fact that the Russians are facing this kind of intransigence from the West. We like to say that it's in Ukraine's best interest to settle the war now, which I think it is. But that also tells you that it's not in Russia's interest to settle the war right now. The Russians are better off extending the length of the war and gaining more territory and doing more damage to the Ukrainian military and turning Ukraine into more of a dysfunctional rump state. So in a very important way, people like Keith Starmer are playing right into the hands of the Russians.
Do you?
Yeah, I have to agree here. And it's not totally clear to me whether, Starmer and Macron and van der Leyen and all these war hawks from Europe actually believe what they're saying, that they actually believe that Putin will invade Poland tomorrow if the West, quote unquote, capitulates from this agreement or from this war, which wouldn't even be a capitulation. It'd be a peace agreement acknowledging the reality, and that's that Russia gained the Donbass when you never even had to have that happen had Zelensky taken the first deal in Istanbul in the early months of the war that would have ended it and preserved those regions for Ukraine. So, hard to disagree with Mearsheimer here. There are people pushing Trump in the direction of keeping this war going, even in his administration, like Kellogg. So, it's not even clear to me how Kellogg in any way differs from the Biden administration policy toward Ukraine, or Anthony Blinken's for that matter, by the way. So,
Do you see any realistic chance of the Russians settling for anything less than what have been their consistent demands since February of 22? Crimea, the Russian-speaking oblasts, three quarters of which they now control militarily. No NATO. It may have been, I don't know if this is still on the table, a neutral status for Ukraine, like Austria or Switzerland. But do you see the Russians settling for anything less than that when they have the upper hand on the battlefield and when they have an American president who's sick and tired of paying for a war?
I think they'd be remarkably foolish to accept anything less than what you describe. I think the other key issue for them is that you get a seriously demilitarized Ukraine that doesn't have offensive capability against Russia. I mean, the thing you want to keep in mind, Judge, is that from the Russians' point of view, what's happening in Ukraine is an existential threat. This is not a minor matter for them. This is life and death. Most people in the West reject that view. They say this is not an existential threat. But what they think doesn't matter. The key issue is what the Russians, and especially Putin, think on this issue. And they have made it unequivocally clear since April 2008 that Ukraine and NATO is an existential threat. And given that perspective, those demands that the Russians are making are reasonable. They may not be reasonable from our point of view or from Ukraine's point of view, but from their point of view, they're reasonable. And they're not going to quit on those demands, especially because, as you said, they are now winning on the battlefield. And if anything, the situation deteriorates further for the Ukrainians and the West on the battlefield.
Yeah, I have to agree that with this, Russia would not nearly have the ability to hold such positions as they do for a potential peace if they weren't in the driver's seat in control of the Donbass region, which what they invaded for was to do. It wasn't to invade Ukraine proper and take Kyiv or any of the horror stories that, many of the Western neocons and NATO shills and fans of the military-industrial complex and their lobbies will have told you. The one aspect that I might say is that I think that Russia might be willing to budge to some extent on its demand for denazification, actually, in Ukraine. This has come up from time to time, but Russia wants a complete dismantling of the Azov regiment and other contingents that are far-right nationalist elements in Ukraine. The Nazis, the literal Nazis that the West has kind of shoved under the rug, the corporate media has stopped reporting on since the invasion in 2022, etc., because it'd be really hard to enforce that. You could dismantle military units, but as an ideology, it's kind of hard to kill abstract ideas in some sense in that regard. So if there was one factor I think Russia may be willing to budge on in terms of peace, it's this ambiguous call for denazification that we hear from time to time from Russia and from Putin. He's brought that up a few times, including in his interview with Tucker Carlson, by the way.
Here's Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Istanbul earlier today. Chris, cut number 2.
There is ample evidence that neither Berlin, nor Paris, nor Brussels, and especially London, they really don't want any peace at all in Ukraine. They decided that since the United States is moving away from active support, which, by the way, will be projected onto NATO as well, then Europe needs to think about itself somehow. Macron has already come up with some kind of European army and is ready to put its nuclear warheads into the common pot. And in this situation, according to our information, they still have conversations with each other. It is impossible to stop the mobilization of Europe against Russia. And in this sense, Ukraine is an invaluable tool.
That's pretty dangerous stuff, isn't it? It is impossible to stop the mobilization of Europe against Russia. They are ready, speaking of the French now, maybe the French and the British, to put nuclear warheads into the common pot? This is obviously a response to Prime Minister Starmer, because he says, and especially London, and he did make these comments after Prime Minister Starmer.
By the way, I disagree with Lavrov here, and he has to know the answer. He's a smart and skilled diplomat, actually, that what European leaders, including Macron and Starmer, are saying right now, they're paper tigers that are all talk. The moment the U.S. walks away from all of its military support in NATO, so comes a peace, and so comes a force of Zelensky to accept a peace. The European nations are not going to be willing to bankroll this conflict once the U.S. gets out of it. Public opinion isn't on their side for that. And even with the influence of their own military-industrial conflicts, respectively, in their countries, it's not going to be enough to subsidize the costs necessary for this conflict. That's why you hear all these people talking about pledges rather than actual money that's been given to Ukraine.
Pardon me, made his.
I think that the foreign minister, Lavrov, is worrying about a threat that's not going to materialize.
Right.
He's assuming that the Europeans can come together in some meaningful way and create a potent military that can threaten Russia, and that they can use French nuclear weapons, or maybe French and British nuclear weapons, to gain coercive leverage over Russia. This is simply not going to happen.
Right.
If anything, the Europeans are going to squabble among themselves. They don't have much military capability to begin with. They're all in economic trouble, and the idea that they're going to, turn each one of their militaries into the Wehrmacht is not going to happen. And with regard to nuclear weapons, French nuclear weapons matter for virtually zero in the Ukraine conflict. And the same is true of British nuclear weapons. So I think that Mr. Lavrov can relax. He doesn't have to worry much about the Europeans presenting a military threat. The big problem that he faces is that, as you said, and as Lavrov himself said, the Europeans are not interested in peace. They're interested in continuing the war. But the Europeans want the Ukrainians to do the fighting. The Europeans don't want to build up a formidable military capability and do the fighting themselves.
I wonder how interested in peace the Americans are. Chris, I don't remember or see the number of the cut, but it's a photograph of a certain United States senator accompanying Secretary of State Rubio. Do you see who's next to Secretary Rubio there in Istanbul? Lindsey Graham. I mean, where the heck are they going to go in negotiating some kind of peace with Senator Graham, the arch warmonger himself, right there?
It is interesting, though, because despite how terrible Lindsey Graham is on foreign policy, if you're a non-interventionist that wants to stop these endless conflicts abroad, U.S. intervention, regime change operation, bombing campaigns, etc., he did seem to scoff at the notion of doing business with Zelensky after Trump had basically told him off in the White House, which was about the best thing I've ever seen Lindsey Graham do, to the extent that it's possible Lindsey Graham could do something good, because we all know how much of a warmonger he is. But yeah, his presence in these negotiations is terrible. Trump continues to fail at surrounding himself with good people that go by his instincts in trying to secure the peace and end wars. Putting yourself around Lindsey Graham is a horrible idea, and it just won't have any semblance of success in solving this.
Well, the answer is they're not going to go anywhere if Graham or Keith Kellogg.
That might have been General Kellogg there as well. I don't know.
Right.
I think it was.
Chris, can you put the second picture up, please?
I think that is General Kellogg on my left as I look at the picture.
Yes.
And I think Lindsey Graham is in the middle and Rubio, of course, is on the right. It's quite a triumvirate. And there are three people who are basically not interested in cutting a deal with the Russians.
Yeah, it's a triumvirate of warmongers. This is insane. And this was the Trump campaign in 2024 to enact peace in Ukraine and get the U.S. disengaged. And then this is the delegation that is, you know, he's surrounding himself with. It's really, really frustrating if you're a non-interventionist. That's not to say that there aren't some other good people around him, especially Steve Witkoff, who really earnestly does want peace. But with these people in your vicinity advising you and kind of influencing you, it's just a recipe for disaster when it comes to U.S. involvement.
Rubio, we have to qualify that with regard to him because he is working for Trump. But the fact of the matter is that you have this big split in the administration, and we talk about all the time, where Trump is on one side, Vance is with him, and then you have this cast of characters that was just in the photograph who tend to be on the other side.
Yeah,
and
that's
the
an
only
understatement.
interesting question is whether Trump is going to put those three people to the side and he's going to negotiate a deal with the Russians. Trump wants peace. Unlike Kellogg, unlike Lindsey Graham. There's no question about that. They're on opposite ends of the dipole. But the question is, will Trump say, enough is enough, and I'm going to cut a deal? But even if he does that, I want to remind you that you still have to worry about how to bring the Ukrainians and the Europeans on board, because there are four players in this situation: Russia, United States, Ukraine, and Europe.
Yeah, I mostly agreed with Mearsheimer here in this segment. He's undeniably correct about the rift within the administration on Ukraine, even though Trump has a clear perspective on this, or it seems pretty clear. Trump has made some mistakes and missteps and, you know, calling this Biden's war, but also repeating the CNN Biden Blinken mantra that Putin wants all of Ukraine. That's just a disastrous opinion that will not bode for any success when it comes to securing peace here. No, he has to push Kellogg and Rubio and Graham aside in the interests of securing peace, and he has to stop funding Ukraine. Because the moment he stops funding Ukraine, the rest will follow. And I think the major problem here is more than peace in Ukraine. I think Trump desires to be the architect of peace in Ukraine. He wants to be the deal master, have the art of the deal with Russia, and be known as a president that served a major conflict in that region, much like Theodore Roosevelt was in, 1905, when he helped settle the Russo-Japanese conflict. This is what Trump wants, and I think until the U.S. gets its act together and just disengages and isn't treated anymore from Russia as a belligerent that it is in their perspective, we will have a peace agreement there. But I do want to hear from what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think that there will be a peace in Ukraine soon and that Trump's strategy is working there? Because at least there are diplomatic overtures being made to Russia, unlike under the Biden administration. Let me know in the comments below, and please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one.